All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to cover one of the most kind of discussed topics today of is it a good idea to buy cheap rental properties? And we're going to talk about kind of some pros and cons around it. And certainly I'll give my viewpoint of how I feel about it. And the beauty of working at American IRA is that I've seen thousands and thousands of transactions from clients. And I've been a real estate investor since 2002. So 20 years in the game, and I've certainly made a tremendous amount of mistakes. And so now ultimately, we're going to just delve into it and see what we come up with here. So I'm Sean McKay with American IRA. And so at American IRA, we are a self-directed provider. So we are one of the few companies that is a fully integrated self-directed IRA company, meaning we have the same ownership group for American IRA, the record-keeping concept, as well as for New Vision Trust Company, which is the parent custodian. And so ultimately, we're different in the industry in that we were founded by investors for investors. And so, as I just mentioned, certainly I've been in real estate for a couple of decades now. Our founder, Jim Hitt, a number of decades as well. And so we want to try to add value to the conversation and in terms of the education. And if you listen to our content, you understand that I certainly don't, quote unquote, sell self-directed IRAs or any investment activities. If anything, I'm in the business of giving, at least from my perspective, kind of a balanced approach to not only the upside, but certainly the downside of any of the investments that our clients make and that we've made ourselves. So this will be an honest discussion. And so we're going to talk about the neighborhoods. We're going to talk about the cash flow around these properties, and ultimately some of the mistakes, again, that we've made in the low end part of the residential real estate market. And so ultimately, when we're looking at prospecting for areas, for properties, excuse me, I think the first thing we want to analyze when a particular deal comes across our desk is, are we looking at a bad property in a good area? Or is it a rough property or a less than desirable property in a rough area? And so if it's the latter, we definitely need to look at the scenario and see if this makes sense, because rough areas are certainly, in my mind, very different than areas where they are kind of starter neighborhoods. They can be in lower price points, but rough and lower price points, in my view, are very, very different. And so ultimately, you can find phenomenal opportunities to invest in lower price point areas in your metropolitan area. And so what you find is that there's kind of this broad brush that a lot of investors or just people in the community think about certain price points as all the same. So if the starting price point in 2022 in your metropolitan area is, let's say, anything under $150,000, there can be an assumption that any property in that price point is a scary area, is a rough area, is a place where people wouldn't want to live. And that's certainly not true. You can find great residents, you can find great communities in those areas. You just have to be very discerning in the way that you look at it. Now, on the other hand, the rough areas to me in those price points are one in which there's going to be a tremendous amount of crime. There's going to be lots of vandalism. You can feel it when you walk through those areas, when you drive through those areas, because it's certainly for adults that have had a variety of life experiences, you get a sense of danger many times. And so it can feel dangerous to be in what I consider the rougher areas. And so ultimately, those stable communities, those areas where there can be some real upside for us to own quality assets and to do business with and take care of residents that are quality human beings, is that a lot of times you'll see a pride of ownership in those communities. So you're seeing well manicured lawns, you're seeing that they're taking care of the exterior of the property, that Again, it could be smaller homes, it can be modest homes, but you can tell that they very much care whether they rent or own these properties, that they look presentable, and that, again, there's just that pride of ownership. So conversely, if you're seeing a lot of cars that are on concrete blocks, so cars on blocks, trucks on blocks, if you're seeing a lot of tarps on roofs because unfortunately those properties have not been repaired, if you're seeing grass that's 3 feet high, lots of just debris all over the front yards, obviously that's not the type of pride of ownership that you'd be hoping for. And so it could be a bad apple, but if you find that the streets are kind of littered with these types of properties, it's very likely that unfortunately that can be a rough and a challenging place to own properties. Now, I certainly have known investors that have gone into those areas knowing that they were very challenging, and piece by piece, they've kind of gentrified those neighborhoods. I know gentrification has gotten kind of a negative viewpoint, and I'm certainly not interested in getting into a political discussion, but they've kind of methodically worked through to improve properties in those neighborhoods. And so that can be a strategy. I just think for those of us that are new to real estate, that is a heavy lifting strategy, and one that can be a lot more dangerous in terms of the outcomes. So in terms of running the cash flow numbers on real estate, whether it's starter properties, whether it's the median type properties or the higher end rentals, I continuously find that there's a lack of basic understanding of how cash flow numbers actually work when you own rental properties. And I think one of the biggest issues, unfortunately, is that so many of these investors have done a phenomenal job coming out of the gates. Out of the last couple of years, they've acquired a tremendous amount of properties. And because of their perceived quote unquote success, because they own X amount of units, they own 10 units, they own 50 units, they owned hundreds or thousands of units in a short period of time, that's to be commended. And I have a lot of respect for that. But the one thing that unfortunately they could be lacking if they've been in the business for 18, 24, 36 months is that they don't have a history of understanding the real costs associated with owning these properties over a long period of time. So we're going to look at a net operating income, and I'm going to point out some very specific things here. So let's say that in your metropolitan area, kind of the lower end of the spectrum for rent values is $900 a month. And let's say that in the metropolitan area as a whole, the vacancy rate is 4 or 5%. We're going to want to allocate a higher percentage of the time that the property is not rented, because it can take longer to find quality tenants for areas that you're going to feel really good about, that have a great work history, that are doing everything that needs to be done to be a successful tenant and following your process to become a tenant. And so in this example, we'll attribute a 8% vacancy rate. So we have an adjusted gross income of $828. So most people will account for taxes and insurance. So we have that plugged in, great. Some will account for property management. Others will say, well, I'm going to manage the property. Well, I don't think most of us get into entrepreneurial activities in order to work for free and to build a business where we know that we're going to be having to put in work and there's not going to be any financial benefit associated with it. So whether it's third-party management or management yourself, I believe that it's a good idea to consider putting a property management fee in there. Whether you take it out in terms of a form of payment each month, if you're the one doing it, that's irrelevant. I just want to make sure that the cash flow is true cash flow. Now, where we have a substantial lack of understanding is when we're talking about the maintenance or the capital expenses associated with the property, because I can't tell you how many times I hear someone interviewed or they're talking about their cash flow for their portfolio, and all they're talking about, again, is taxes and insurance and maybe a property management fee. But the maintenance and the capital expense is a real, and it's a significant expense associated with owning a property. I was actually, in my mind, a little bit light here in allocating $200 a month from my portfolio. I'm usually going to average plugging in about $300 a month for this. But even with the $200 a month that we're allocating here, we have a net cash flow of 328 a month. And so again, that's not what a lot of people would perceive their cash flow to be. They would say $900, maybe 100 or 200 for taxes and insurance. So I'm really cash flowing this thing about 750 a month. So we need to be very cognizant of the fact that that is a real cost. The capital expenditures, the maintenance. Think about it this way: roofs are not free, HVAC units are not free. Tenants move out of the property, even if they've stayed for a few years, you're going to be repainting the property at different points. You're going to update kitchens, plumbing, electrical, just drywall. All these sorts of things are going to add up over time. And so we really need to allocate costs for that, windows, et cetera. So for me, when we look at the lessons learned, the cash flow is the big one. I think that cash flow is really underestimated in terms of the cost. I think the other thing that is common sense from an intellectual conversation standpoint, but can become a rude awakening for a lot of us, is that with lower price point properties, it makes sense that it is much easier to get into those properties because they are less expensive. However, there is a smaller pool of people that are going to be interested in buying properties in the lowest price point for your area, as opposed to kind of the cookie cutter median type of properties where everyone is in agreement that it's good school districts and it's a desirable place to live and it's widely considered a very safe area, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be very easy to get into lower price point properties, but it can be exceptionally difficult to sell those properties, especially as the real estate market softens. Now, again, we're in December of 2022. And so the last number of years, the real estate market was increasingly hot. And 2020, 2021, the first part of 2022 was just scorching hot. Everyone was a real estate genius. You bought something and it went up considerably in the months following. I think we all understand, though, that's kind of an abnormal situation. It had some really unique features that allowed that real estate market to get so hot. And so ultimately, as we move forward, we don't know where the real estate market is going. I certainly do not have a crystal ball. What I can say is that growing up in Florida, having purchased properties going into the 2008 meltdown, it is psychologically different than what most people think that it is when the value of their properties goes down so considerably. And so whether you can sell it or not, psychologically, it can be difficult when the asset values go down. And so ultimately, the lower end, there's a perception that the value of the property can only go down so much because it is at the low end of the spectrum for that area. What I can tell you is my understanding and my belief and my experiences have been that the lower end of the market actually gets hit disproportionately hard to the median and the top end of the market. So for example, going into the pandemic, along with family members, I bought condos in our kind of sleepy little area in Florida on the East Coast. And so properties over a series of years, we were purchasing between about 100 to about 140. And so those $140,000 properties in 2010, 2011, as the meltdown had kind of done what it did to the real estate market, to people's lives, et cetera, that $140,000 condo was on the market in the 30s. So bought for 140, wait a few years, and all you ever hear from everyone is real estate goes up and appreciation, and you're getting to amortize your loan, et cetera, et cetera. You fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, and that property is now worth $30,000 or $25,000. Now, certainly it's come back up, but again, psychologically, that is a real thing. Conversely, the more expensive parts of town, so let's say the $600,000 house, those weren't selling either during the toughest parts, but the $600,000 houses were not worth $200,000 during the worst of the recession. They simply were not selling, but they were selling for more like 450 versus again 200. So just something to think about, that it's easy to get in, but it can be very difficult to get out of certain types of real estate. And I would say the same thing for sellers that are desperate and willing to do anything. Sometimes you can find really tremendous opportunities, but sometimes those sellers are desperate because it is a very difficult area that their property is in. And so thus you're inheriting their issues, if that makes sense. And so ultimately, with these properties in lower price point areas, I think for me, the wrap up is that we can find great properties as long as it's a stable community. You can find tenants that want to just live a great life. They work hard, they have a great family, social activities, etc. For whatever reason, they're not necessarily interested, or it's not a high priority to own a property themselves, but they can take phenomenal care of your property for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And that can be a true win-win. If you take care of them, they take care of you and your property. And that's a great way to be. And so ultimately, the nice thing about these lower price point properties is that, assuming you're pretty rational in the way that you structure your debt on the properties, if you have a single property that, let's say you purchase for 150,000 and you put let's say a 10% down payment, so $15,000, obviously there's closing costs, etc. The debt that you have on that property, assuming that it cash flows well, if that property becomes vacant, that can be an easier component of debt to deal with, versus if it is a $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 mortgage. And even if it cash flows almost similarly well if it's rented, the vacancy on the $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 property is a lot more difficult to deal with for those just getting started, as opposed to, again, the say the $135,000 mortgage or something like that. So ultimately, just kind of keep those things in mind. I would say that the great thing about rental properties, especially in the starter component of the real estate market, is that during those recessions, those 2001, 2008s, perhaps we're in the beginning of a recession. We keep redefining what recession means, but if we're in the early stages of a recession nowadays, the nice thing about rents is that historically they don't pull back, and they certainly don't pull back to the degree that the prices on houses can pull back in challenging times. And so depending upon how aggressive you are with rents, you may not find that the rents decrease at all. You may be able to even increase rents. I think rents is a very imperfect science. So you can have identical properties on the same street, and one might be renting for $900 or $1,000 because the tenant has been in there for 10 years and it's just easy and it works for everyone. And you can have that exact same property that's rented for $1,000 on house A that's renting for $1,800 in house B, because it's a new owner and they're wanting to be aggressive and get it full value for the asset that they've just purchased. And so when people talk about rent values, to me, I think we have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because it's an imperfect science. So a lot of babbling today. So hopefully there was something in there that was useful for you. We do have 2 YouTube channels. We have American IRA LLC, where we talk about the self-directed concepts, and we have The Lousy Investor, where we're talking about just kind of pure investment ideas. Again, mistakes I've made, lessons I've learned, and every once in a while we get a win out of there. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you're interested in a discussion on self-directed accounts, today was certainly pretty light on the self-directed IRA aspect, but I'd love to be a resource for you. You can email me, Sean, SEAN, at AmericanIRA.com, or you can call our office at 828-257-4949. All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.